Emma had always believed that she and her husband Daniel shared the kind of love that could withstand anything. Their life together was picture perfect, at least on the surface. Daniel was the kind of man who made people feel safe, steady, and predictable. He was well liked by friends, respected by colleagues, and deeply adored by Emma. For 5 years, they had built a life together filled with laughter, quiet mornings, and shared dreams of starting a family. So when Emma finally discovered she was pregnant, she thought it would be the happiest moment of their lives. But from the second the words left her lips, something in Daniel's expression shifted. His usual warmth was replaced by something cold, distant, almost fearful. It was as if she had just said something terrible rather than something wonderful. And then, as quickly as it appeared, his unease was gone, replaced with a forced smile and empty congratulations. But Emma knew what she saw. And in that moment, she knew something was terribly wrong. At first, she tried to push the feeling away. Maybe he was just overwhelmed, surprised, or even nervous about the responsibility ahead. But as the days passed, Daniel became even more withdrawn. He started working late, avoiding conversations about the baby, and barely looking at Emma. He wasn't just distracted, he was hiding something. And the more Emma tried to reach him, the further he pulled away. She found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment over and over again. What had she seen in his eyes? Was it fear? Guilt? Regret? And if so, why? The man she had trusted more than anyone in the world was slipping through her fingers, and she had no idea why. But deep in her gut, she knew one thing: her pregnancy had triggered something in him, something dark, something he never wanted her to know. The breaking point came when she found his phone buzzing with a message in the middle of the night. She had never been the type to check his messages, but tonight, something told her she needed to. With trembling hands, she picked it up, her heart pounding in her ears. The screen lit up with a single text, and as her eyes scanned the words, her breath caught in her throat. The message was short, simple, but it shattered everything she thought she knew about her husband. "We need to talk. She can't find out the truth." Emma's entire body went cold. The truth about what? What was Daniel hiding from her? And, more terrifyingly, how far would he go to make sure she never found out? Emma sat frozen in bed, her fingers tightening around Daniel's phone as her mind raced. The message was from an unknown number, but that didn't matter. The words alone sent a chill down her spine. She can't find out the truth. What truth? What was Daniel so desperate to keep from her? She quickly glanced at him, still sound asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. How could he sleep so soundly when something so sinister lingered just beneath the surface of their marriage? She debated waking him, demanding answers right then and there, but something inside her told her to wait. If he was hiding something, confronting him without proof might push him further into secrecy. No, she needed to be smart about this. She needed to find out the truth on her own. Carefully, she placed his phone back on the nightstand, her heart hammering as she lay back down, staring into the darkness. Sleep was out of the question. The next morning, Emma forced herself to act normal, though every moment felt surreal. She studied Daniel over breakfast, searching for cracks in his facade. He was pleasant, affectionate even, pressing a kiss to her forehead before heading out the door for work. But now, she saw him differently. Every word, every movement, every glance felt calculated, rehearsed. Had he always been this way, and she had just been too blind to notice? Or was this a new version of him, one molded by fear of whatever secret he was keeping? As soon as he left, she grabbed his phone again, only to realize it was locked with a passcode. She had never needed to check before, but now it was like a barrier between her and the truth. Frustrated, she set it down. If she wanted answers, she would have to look elsewhere. Determined, she started retracing the past few weeks, searching for signs she might have missed. Daniel had been spending more time away, late nights at work, unexplained meetings, an unusual number of business trips. Had she been naive in believing him? A sudden thought sent her rushing to their laundry room. His suitcase from his most recent trip was still there, unpacked. She opened it with shaky hands, digging through neatly folded clothes, until something at the bottom made her stomach drop. A hotel keycard, one from a different city than where he claimed to be. She flipped it over, running her thumb over the hotel's logo, her pulse pounding. He had lied about where he was. But why? And who had he been with? Doubt crept into her mind, weaving its way through every memory of their marriage. Was this about another woman? An affair? It seemed like the obvious answer, but something about the text message told her it was bigger than that. This wasn't just guilt, it was fear. And if Daniel was afraid of her finding out, that meant whatever he was hiding wasn't just about him. It was about her, about them. The weight of that realization settled heavily in her chest. She thought she knew her husband, the man she had vowed to spend her life with. But now, it was clear Daniel was living a life she knew nothing about. And whatever truth he was hiding, it was only a matter of time before she uncovered it. Emma sat at the kitchen table, gripping the hotel keycard in one hand, her mind spiraling with possibilities. Every logical explanation crumbled under the weight of the text message she had seen the night before. If Daniel had lied about where he was, what else had he been lying about? She needed proof, something concrete that would shatter the carefully crafted illusion of their marriage. Her first instinct was to check his credit card statements. He wasn't careless. He had always been meticulous about finances. But maybe, just maybe, he had slipped up. She quickly pulled out her laptop and logged into their shared account, scrolling through recent transactions. Her stomach twisted as she spotted a charge from the same hotel. But something was off. The date didn't match his last trip. He had been there before weeks ago. That meant whatever he was involved in had been going on for longer than she realized. Just as she was about to take a screenshot, her screen flickered, and suddenly the page went blank. Confused, she refreshed the site, only to be met with an error message. Account temporarily unavailable due to suspicious activity. Panic gripped her. Had Daniel somehow known she was looking? That was impossible. He wasn't even home. She grabbed her phone and tried to log in again, but the account was locked. Someone had changed the settings. The realization hit her like a freight train. She wasn't just looking into Daniel, someone was looking back. Before she could process the weight of that thought, her phone buzzed. A new message. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. Her heart pounded as she read the words, "Stop digging. This isn't what you think." Her fingers trembled as she stared at the screen. It wasn't Daniel. Someone else was watching her, aware of her every move. The walls of her home, the place where she had once felt safest, now felt suffocating. She wasn't just dealing with a cheating husband, she was entangled in something much darker. Determined, she decided to go to the hotel herself. If Daniel had been there before, there had to be a record. But just as she grabbed her keys, the doorbell rang, making her jump. Peering through the window, she saw a familiar face, Natalie, her best friend. Relief flooded through her. Maybe she could confide in her, get another perspective. She swung open the door, forcing a smile, but Natalie's expression was tense, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid of being seen. "Emma," she said quietly, stepping inside and shutting the door behind her. "We need to talk." Emma's heart sank. The way Natalie said it, the urgency in her voice, it was clear. She knew something. "What is it?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Natalie hesitated, biting her lip, as if choosing her words carefully. "I think Daniel is in trouble," she finally said. "And if you don't stop, you will be too." A cold wave of dread washed over Emma. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about survival. Emma's mind raced as she stared at Natalie, trying to make sense of what she had just said. Daniel was in trouble. That didn't make any sense. Wasn't she the one being lied to? And yet, Natalie's urgency was undeniable. Emma's fingers curled around the hotel keycard in her pocket, feeling its cold edge pressing against her palm. If Natalie knew something, why had she waited until now to say anything? Before Emma could ask, a sound cut through the tense silence. Natalie's phone vibrated violently on the table. She snatched it up, her face draining of color as she read the screen. Without a word, she turned the phone toward Emma. It was another message from the same unknown number. "You should have kept your mouth shut." A chill ran down Emma's spine. Someone knew they were talking. Someone was watching. She shot up from her chair and rushed to the window, scanning the street outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, stretching across the pavement, like fingers reaching toward the house. Parked cars, neighbors walking their dogs, nothing looked out of place, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. "Natalie, what the hell is going on?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. Natalie hesitated before whispering, "I didn't know how to tell you. But Daniel, he wasn't staying at that hotel alone." Emma's heart lurched. "You knew?" she hissed, her voice a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. But before Natalie could answer, Emma's phone buzzed on the counter. Another message. Hands trembling, she reached for it, already bracing herself for another threat. But when she read the text, her breath caught in her throat. "You've been looking in the wrong place. Check your emails." A cold sweat broke out on her skin. That was different from the other messages. Not a warning, more like a direction. Her pulse thundered as she unlocked her laptop and opened her inbox. At first, nothing seemed unusual, until she spotted an unread message with no subject line, sent from an unfamiliar email address. Heart hammering, she clicked it open. There was no text, no signature, just an attachment. A video file. Her finger hovered over the trackpad, dread crawling up her spine. She didn't want to see what was inside, but she had to. With a deep breath, she double-clicked. The screen flickered, and grainy security footage filled the display. It was the hotel lobby, time-stamped 2 weeks ago. She watched as a man walked in, head down, baseball cap low over his face. Her stomach twisted as he approached the front desk. Then he turned slightly, just enough for the camera to catch a glimpse of his profile. It wasn't Daniel. Emma's body went rigid. The figure was familiar, but not her husband. It was someone else, someone she never would have suspected. She shot a look at Natalie, who was still staring at her own phone, lips pressed into a tight line. The color had completely drained from her face. Emma turned back to the screen just in time to see another person enter the frame, approaching the man in the baseball cap. When she recognized them, her knees nearly buckled. It was Natalie. Emma's mind reeled. The messages, the warnings, the cryptic clues, everything suddenly shifted, tilting into an entirely new, terrifying reality. This wasn't just about Daniel. This wasn't just about an affair. Natalie had been hiding something bigger than Emma had ever imagined. And now, Emma wasn't sure if she was standing next to a friend or an enemy. Emma felt the room closing in around her, the air thick with an unspoken threat she couldn't quite put into words. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned slowly to Natalie, whose face remained frozen in pale, wide-eyed silence. The video on Emma's laptop screen looped again, replaying the haunting image of Natalie meeting the mysterious man at the hotel. A million thoughts crashed in Emma's mind. Why was Natalie there? What did she know? And why had she kept it from her? But before Emma could demand answers, Natalie's phone buzzed again, the vibration cutting through the suffocating tension. She hesitated before glancing at the screen, her expression shifting from fear to something else, dread. Without a word, she shoved the phone into her purse and took a step back, her movements stiff, unnatural. "I have to go," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. Emma's gut twisted. "Go where?" she asked, stepping forward. But Natalie was already retreating, fumbling for the doorknob like a trapped animal desperate to escape. "Natalie, wait." Emma's voice sharpened as she reached out, grabbing her arm. But the second their skin touched, Natalie yanked away with a force Emma hadn't expected. Their eyes met for a brief, electric moment. Natalie's were filled with something between terror and guilt. And then she was gone, the door slamming behind her so hard that the walls trembled. Emma stood there, her breath shallow, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. Natalie was scared, but of what? Of Emma? Of whoever had sent those messages? The thought made Emma's stomach churn. She turned back to the laptop, staring at the paused video frame where Natalie and the unknown man stood just inches apart in the hotel lobby. Her hands clenched into fists. She needed answers. If Natalie wasn't going to give them to her, she'd find them herself. Determined, she grabbed her keys and bolted out the door, jumping into her car and heading toward Natalie's apartment. The city blurred past her in streaks of red and yellow as the evening traffic thickened. Every stoplight felt like a taunt, every second wasted increasing the unease curling in her chest. She checked her rearview mirror compulsively, the paranoia gnawing at her senses. Maybe it was nothing, maybe just nerves, but every car behind her felt like it had been following her for too long. She turned onto a side street, taking a different route, only to find the same dark SUV lingering 2 cars back. Her grip tightened on the wheel. Coincidence? Or something worse? By the time she reached Natalie's building, the unease had settled into full-blown dread. The SUV was nowhere in sight anymore, but that didn't mean she wasn't being watched. She parked a block away and approached the apartment on foot, her heart pounding harder with every step. The streetlights above flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. As she reached the entrance, she hesitated. Natalie's window was dark. No signs of movement. A deep, unsettling silence filled the air, like the city itself was holding its breath. She knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. Swallowing hard, she tried the handle. It was unlocked. A fresh wave of alarm surged through her, but she pushed inside anyway, her fingers fumbling for the light switch. The apartment was a mess. Drawers yanked open, papers scattered across the floor. The couch cushions slashed open, stuffing spilling out like the remains of something gutted. And in the middle of the chaos, Natalie's phone lay abandoned on the carpet, the screen still glowing. Emma's blood ran cold. Someone had been here. Someone had torn this place apart, looking for something. And Natalie was gone. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the wreckage of Natalie's apartment. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city beyond the broken window. She stepped forward cautiously, her fingers trembling as she reached for Natalie's abandoned phone. The screen flickered, revealing the last text message received a single name she never expected to see. Ryan, her husband. A cold wave of confusion crashed over her, followed by something worse, pure, unfiltered dread. Emma's mind scrambled for an explanation, for a reason why his name would be the last thing on Natalie's phone before she vanished. Her hands clenched the device so tightly, her knuckles turned white. No, this had to be some mistake. Ryan had nothing to do with this. He couldn't have anything to do with this. But deep down, something gnawed at her, a voice whispering that maybe she had been looking in the wrong direction all along. She bolted out of the apartment, her pulse pounding so loudly she could barely hear the world around her. Every piece of the puzzle suddenly felt wrong, misplaced, twisted, manipulated. The threatening messages, the hidden hotel meetings, the SUV that had followed her. What if this wasn't just about Natalie? What if she had been the target all along? The thought sent her into a spiral. her hands tightening around the steering wheel as she sped home, her mind replaying every moment with Ryan over the past few weeks. The way he had dismissed her concerns, the way he had acted so calm while she unraveled. The strange, late-night calls, the missing hours unaccounted for. By the time she reached their driveway, her body was trembling. The house was dark, but his car was there, parked neatly in its usual spot. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing through the front door, her heart hammering in her chest. The air inside was thick, suffocating. She called out his name, her voice hoarse with fear, but there was no answer. And then, as she stepped into the kitchen, she saw him. Ryan stood by the dining table, his back to her, his phone in his hand. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't his face that made her stomach drop. It was what lay on the table beside him. A folder, thick with documents, photographs, and scribbled notes. And at the very top, clipped to the cover, was a picture of her. Emma's breath hitched as she reached for it with shaking hands, but Ryan placed his palm flat over the folder, stopping her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice too steady, too controlled. And in that moment, she knew whatever she thought she knew about her husband, about Natalie, about everything she had been wrong. Emma's stomach twisted as Ryan slid the folder away from her, his eyes dark and unreadable. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against her lungs as she struggled to steady her breath. She didn't even know what she was supposed to ask first, what was in the folder. Why was Natalie's name connected to him? Why had he been lying to her? The questions tangled in her throat, but before she could force any of them out, Ryan exhaled slowly and gestured for her to sit. She didn't. She couldn't. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice low and careful, as if he was choosing every word like a chess move. "But you wouldn't stop digging. Now you're in this, Emma. Whether you want to be or not." Her body tensed, her mind racing to catch up. She had spent weeks trying to unravel the mystery behind the threatening messages, Natalie's disappearance, and the tangled mess of secrets that kept leading her in circles. But now, standing across from her husband in their quiet, dimly lit kitchen, she realized the truth was far worse than anything she had imagined. "What did you do?" she whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. Ryan's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Guilt? Regret? Fear? He glanced down at the folder, then back at her, as if he was making a decision in real time. Finally, he slid it across the table. "If you read this, you can't take it back," he said. "And if you know too much, they won't just stop with Natalie." Emma's pulse pounded so violently, she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. They? Who the hell was they? Every fiber of her being screamed at her to grab the folder, to rip it open, and finally get the answers she had been chasing. But at the same time, a sickening fear slithered up her spine. Ryan wasn't warning her. He was pleading with her. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "Who are you protecting?" Ryan's silence stretched on too long. He rubbed his temples, his breath coming out uneven. And then, finally, he looked up at her, his expression hollow. "You think Natalie was just your friend," he said quietly. "You think she just got caught up in something. But, Emma, she was never who you thought she was." Emma's body went cold. He leaned in, lowering his voice like someone might be listening. "You have one choice. Walk away now, forget everything, and we pretend this never happened." His fingers curled into fists. "Or you open that folder and learn the truth, but if you do, they'll know." A heavy silence settled between them, and in that moment, Emma realized there was no right choice. If she walked away, she would never know what happened to Natalie, why she had disappeared, or why her own husband was tangled in the middle of this nightmare. But if she stayed, if she chose to know, there was no going back. Ryan's voice cut through the silence one last time. "Decide now, Emma. Because once you cross that line, there's no undoing it." Emma's fingers trembled as she flipped open the folder, her eyes scanning the pages filled with names, transactions, and something far worse, photographs. The images blurred together in a sickening haze of familiarity. Natalie, standing beside a man Emma had never seen before, exchanging something small, discreet, and urgent. Another showed Ryan in the same frame, his expression locked in a grim determination, his hand gripping a briefcase. The deeper she looked, the more her stomach twisted. Some of the names on the documents weren't just strangers. They were people she knew, people she had trusted. Her heart pounded violently as her eyes landed on one name that made her entire body go cold. Detective Harper. The very person who had been helping her, guiding her, feeding her bits and pieces of information, was right there in black and white. Involved. Complicit. A rush of nausea hit her as realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. It wasn't just Ryan. It wasn't just Natalie. This wasn't a tangled love affair gone wrong, or a simple case of deception. It was a network, something vast, something orchestrated, and now she had stepped too far in. Ryan had been trying to keep her out, but it had never been about protecting her from the truth. It had been about protecting her from the people who had everything to lose if she found out. Ryan's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, sharp and low. "You should have listened." Emma looked up, her breath catching in her throat. His entire body was rigid, his eyes dark with something between fury and desperation. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself from grabbing the file out of her hands. But it was too late for that. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You lied about everything." "I had to." His voice broke slightly, and for a split second, she saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who used to make her feel safe. But now, all she could see was the betrayal. "You don't understand what you've done, Emma." A sudden crash from outside made them both jump. The unmistakable sound of shattering glass sent adrenaline surging through her veins. Someone was here. Someone new. Ryan moved first, yanking her toward him just as the front door burst open. The dimly lit kitchen was thrown into chaos as heavy footsteps pounded against the hardwood floor. Emma's pulse roared in her ears as she saw a dark figure move through the doorway. She expected an attacker, a masked intruder, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw next. Detective Harper stepped into the room, gun in hand, his face eerily calm. "Emma," he said evenly, his gaze flicking between her and Ryan, "I need you to come with me." Now, her entire body locked up. The betrayal sank deeper, cutting like a knife. "You?" she choked out, shaking her head in disbelief. Ryan shifted in front of her, his body tense, shielding her without a second thought. "She's not going anywhere with you." Harper's jaw ticked, but his expression remained eerily neutral. "You think you can stop this? You think you can save her?" His eyes settled on Emma, colder than she'd ever seen them. "You don't understand the kind of people you're up against. You should have stayed out of it." Emma's breath hitched. People. Not just Harper. Not just Ryan. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. And now, she was trapped right in the center of it. Emma's entire body was taut with adrenaline as she stood frozen between the two men, her mind racing through every possible escape. The air was thick with tension, suffocating in its weight, and the silence stretched unbearably as Detective Harper kept his gun trained on Ryan. Ryan, in turn, hadn't moved, his body positioned in front of Emma like a shield, his fists clenched as if he was waiting for the exact moment to strike. Every nerve in Emma's body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Not yet. Not until she understood the full extent of what was happening. "You were never supposed to find out," Harper finally said, his voice unsettlingly calm, like he was discussing something as mundane as a traffic ticket. His fingers flexed around the gun, his expression unreadable. "You think you stumbled onto this? You think any of this was by chance? He let out a slow exhale, tilting his head slightly. You were led here, Emma. The words hit like a gut punch, knocking the breath from her lungs. Led here? Her stomach twisted violently as she pieced together the implications. The messages, the threats, the so-called warnings that had drawn her deeper and deeper into the mystery. Had it all been orchestrated? Manipulated? No, she whispered, shaking her head as if denial could change the truth. That's not possible. Harper let out a low chuckle, his eyes dark with something unreadable. You've always been so determined, haven't you? So desperate to know the truth. His gaze flickered to Ryan for a brief moment, then back to her. He tried to protect you, I'll give him that. But the truth was never going to stay buried. He took a small step forward, his voice dropping an octave. Now you get to decide how this ends. Emma's heartbeat pounded wildly in her chest. Ryan shifted slightly, his muscles tensed, ready to move. But the look in his eyes wasn't just desperation, it was resignation. Like he knew there was only one way this could go. That terrified her more than the gun pointed at them. Then, in a move so fast, it barely registered, Ryan lunged. A deafening gunshot echoed through the room. Emma screamed, flinching as time seemed to slow to a crawl. Ryan crashed into Harper with full force, sending both men tumbling to the floor. The gun clattered to the ground, spinning out of reach as the two grappled violently, fists landing with sickening cracks against flesh and bone. Blood splattered across the hardwood as Harper fought back with surprising strength, twisting out of Ryan's grasp and sending a brutal punch straight to his ribs. Ryan staggered, but didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Emma's pulse roared in her ears as she scrambled toward the gun, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She barely registered Harper slamming Ryan's head against the floor, barely heard the choked sound Ryan made as he struggled to keep fighting. All she could focus on was the cold steel beneath her fingers as she gripped the weapon and turned it on Harper. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. Harper froze, his breathing heavy, his eyes locking onto hers with an unreadable expression. There was no fear, no panic, just the same eerie calmness he had carried from the start, like he had already planned for this moment. Slowly, he lifted his hands in mock surrender, blood dripping from his knuckles. "Go ahead," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "Pull the trigger." Her hands trembled. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to end this, to make sure he could never hurt anyone again. But something held her back. A sickening feeling curled in her gut as she stared into his eyes, searching for anything that would make this moment make sense. Then Harper smirked, and suddenly it clicked. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she glanced down at Ryan, his face bruised and bloodied, but his eyes were filled with something she hadn't expected. Guilt. "No," she breathed, realization slamming into her like a freight train. It was never just him. Harper let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Took you long enough." Emma's grip on the gun faltered as she staggered back a step, her entire world tilting beneath her feet. The betrayal ran deeper than she ever could have imagined. And the worst part? She didn't even know who to trust anymore. The room was eerily quiet now, the echoes of violence still lingering in the air, like ghosts that refused to be laid to rest. Emma stood frozen, the weight of the gun still heavy in her trembling hands, though she no longer had the strength to lift it. Harper lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath his temple, his smirk still faintly present, even in unconsciousness. But it wasn't him that held Emma's attention, it was Ryan, the man who had stood by her side, who had sworn to protect her, who had nearly died fighting for her, and yet the guilt in his eyes had told a different story, a story she had never wanted to believe. The betrayal ran deeper than she ever could have imagined, twisting through every moment of trust, every desperate plea, every whispered reassurance that they would get through this together. Because now, she knew, he had been a part of it. Maybe not in the way Harper was, maybe not in the cold, calculated way that had sent her spiraling into this nightmare, but he had known more than he let on. He had kept things from her. And in doing so, he had destroyed the one thing she thought they had left: honesty. Ryan staggered to his feet, blood dripping from a deep gash along his forehead, his eyes pleading with her even before he spoke. "Emma," he breathed, his voice raw, exhausted. "You have to believe me. I never wanted any of this." His hands, shaking, reached out as if to close the distance between them, but she took a step back. The air between them felt colder now, like a chasm had opened that neither of them could cross. Her mind reeled, cycling through everything that had led her here, every warning sign she had ignored, every red flag she had justified. The missing pieces of the puzzle had been there all along, she had just refused to see them. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze, even though the sight of him now only brought pain. "How much did you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan's expression crumbled, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words. "Enough," he admitted finally, the single word hitting like a sledgehammer to her chest. "Enough to know that if I told you the truth, you would have run. And I couldn't let that happen." His voice cracked, thick with regret, but Emma couldn't find it in herself to comfort him. Not now. Her fingers curled around the gun before she slowly, deliberately, set it down on the table beside her. She wasn't going to become what they had tried to turn her into. Whatever justice needed to come from this would not be in her hands, not like this. Harper would face the consequences. And as for Ryan, she wasn't sure what came next. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the suffocating silence, signaling the end of the nightmare she had been trapped in. Soon, officers would storm through the door, weapons drawn, demanding answers she wasn't even sure she could give. And when that happened, when the dust finally settled, she would have a choice to make. She could walk away, leave everything behind, start over somewhere new, where the ghosts of betrayal couldn't follow her. Or she could stay, fight for the truth, until every last lie had been uncovered, even if it destroyed what little she had left. Ryan's gaze never left her, his eyes silently begging for something: understanding, forgiveness, maybe even another chance. But Emma knew deep down that some betrayals could never be undone. Some wounds didn't heal, no matter how much time was given. As the sirens screamed just outside the door, she took one last look at him, memorizing the man he had been, the man she had loved, before stepping away. The choice had already been made. She would walk out that door, and she wouldn't look back. And no matter how much it hurt, she knew this was the only ending that could ever be.